I've talked extensively on this channel about why I'm a Protestant, but today I want to talk about something far more important: why I'm a Christian. You see, today the center of gravity in Christian content seems to be all about talking about which type of Christian you should be and arguing and debating about this. Should you be Catholic or Orthodox? Should you be mainline Protestant or evangelical? And this is all well and good if kept in perspective. But if not, at best it can feel like missing the forest for the trees, and at worst, it can seem like people passionately rearranging the chairs on the Titanic. The fact is, none of this matters if there's no good reason to be a Christian in the first place. Or, in the language of the Apostle Paul, and if Christ has not been raised, then our preaching is in vain, and your faith is in vain. So today, I want to share why I've given my life to this. I'll say from the outset, I don't consider myself an apologist. I feel much more drawn to Socrates asking questions than the skilled persuaders of our day, and I'd much rather read the mystics than modern analytical theologians. I also want to say I understand why a lot of people struggle to believe this stuff. So if you happen to be watching this as a non-Christian, this is just my story. At the end of the day, I'm a Christian because I find Jesus utterly compelling. It really is kind of simple, but let me explain a bit because that hasn't always been the case. I grew up in a Christian house. My own Christianity is inextricably tied up with my own context. And while I think Kierkegaard is right that there's no follower at second hand and everyone must at some point be gripped by God, there's also no denying that our context shapes us in innumerable ways. From my earliest memories, I had a passion for God. It was a passion that sometimes made very little sense. My parents started attending church soon after I was born, and while my sister was running around the house singing Britney Spears, I was making my own songs saying, "Jesus is alive, believe," at like 3 years old. I'm pretty sure my parents worried that the Sunday school they'd sent me to was a cult. It didn't make sense that I'd become so enamored by this so quickly, but I had been. In any case, as the years went by, I'd learned to read and soon wear the covers off my kids' Bible. I loved the stories, and I learned to inhabit the Christian story from a very young age. Later, I'd read about missionaries, and they'd become my heroes. That is what I thought was the pinnacle of what life was all about. In church and at the small private school I went to, I was the standout Christian kid. In some ways, that was a wonderful thing. I got a lot of care and attention given to me because I showed an interest. In other ways, though, I think it kind of set me up to feel as though I had this identity to maintain that wasn't natural for a young kid just trying to find his way. Fast forward a bit, I switched to public school in 8th grade, and I remember telling my parents, it makes no sense for Christians to be all together in Christian schools. I need to tell people about Jesus. So I switched schools. I led FCA, instituted team prayers as captain of the soccer team, and enjoyed this new life. Athleticism and academic prowess kind of kept me from being ostracized for being a Christian, and things were going well. Then everything changed. Between my sophomore and junior year, my mom was diagnosed with breast cancer, my sister lost her ability to walk, a scandal broke out at my church, and I was introduced to this guy named Christopher Hitchens. From a young age, Christianity had placed in me a very firm sense of right and wrong. But for the first time, I began to think that Christianity might be on the side of wrong, not right. God just didn't seem good. And this wasn't just because bad things were going on in my life. Hitchens made me wonder if both Christians and the God we worshipped were more often moral monsters than moral exemplars. Slowly, I began to drift away from my faith. I was still driven by its moral vision, though. I spent that next summer teaching English in Peru. I decided I wanted to study medicine to do Doctors Without Borders. I still wanted to change the world. I just kind of thought faith was unnecessary to this at best, and maybe a hindrance at worst. Eventually, though, I found I couldn't help but feel a tug toward the figure of Jesus. It's kind of hard to explain, but even if I didn't like Christianity, there was just something about Jesus. I still saw the world through the lens of a crucified Messiah. I realized I was running away from a lot of things, but Jesus wasn't one of those. And as I slowly gave him a second look, I found him even more compelling than ever. All the problems I saw seemed to find their solution in Jesus. In a lot of ways, I wasn't even sure if it was true, this whole Christianity stuff. But it was beautiful, or at least Jesus was. And it was good. And that was enough to reignite my interest in whether or not it was true. So a mentor of mine began taking me on these long walks through the woods once a week. and we would just ask the big questions about life, meaning, and God. Eventually, I found that something like classical theism just made sense to me. It's not to say it was bulletproof. I still had questions, but at some fundamental level, it just made sense. And if it was possible for it to be true, I really wanted it to be. I mean, the beautiful and the good cried out to be completed by the true, and finding that to be the case was the greatest delight. But in some ways, I think I believed it before I was ever convinced it was true. I started patterning my life after Jesus. I found that his ways worked. In that time, I remember telling my mentor, I don't know if I'd believe this stuff if it didn't work, but it just does. And I don't mean that in some like prosperity gospel sense. I mean that in the sense that it seemed to answer the deep needs of my heart. In time, the propositions would come. I'd realize I could sign on the dotted line of the statement of faith, but in some ways that was kind of a formality. Doctrine followed life for me. I experienced the truth of it before I think I knew it. But that still left the church. And as I went further down this path, I'd reluctantly end up saying, Jesus, if the church is your bride, I guess I can't give up on it either. And then things changed. I could still see all the mess of the church. I'd go through further church pain. I'd watch people leave and be scandalized, and so much of me could understand why they did that. But even more of me felt that giving up on church was just an impossibility for me. It was my home, I realized. I mean, for all its mess, I still feel nowhere more at home than in church. For all the complications of belief, for all the questions that the problem of evil presents, I don't even feel I could disbelieve now if I tried. Asking me to disbelieve in God is like asking me to not catch my breath at a sunset over the ocean nor think it's beautiful. It's just natural to me. There's this line in Evelyn Waugh's Brideshead Revisited where Sebastian and Charles are arguing about faith, and Charles insists, you can't seriously believe all that stuff. And he talks about like the nativity story. And Sebastian says, oh yes, I believe that. It's a lovely idea. Charles responds, but you can't believe things because they're a lovely idea. And Sebastian says in turn, but I do. That's how I believe. In a lot of ways, I think that speaks to my own experience. My belief is a convergence of beauty, goodness, and truth, but in so many ways it starts and ends with beauty. I find this compelling, that God is love, that God would enter into humanity to heal our broken humanity from the inside out, that God would take the form of a baby, that he would hang from a cross for us and say to the very people who killed him, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. That the story of the universe is one in which God is drawing all things into himself to restore and redeem it all. It's the most beautiful story that there is. And yes, I think there are reasons for believing it to be true, and I do believe it's true. But the reasons for belief aren't necessarily the reason I believe, if that makes sense. Like on their own, they're kind of cold, lifeless, and uncertain. They provide what we call motives of credibility, but they aren't the thing itself. I think Kierkegaard is right. At least for me, it's not reasons that persuade. It's an encounter with God through the beauty of the gospel revealed in Jesus. That's it. I believe because it's beautiful. I believe because it's good. I believe because it's true. As someone who loves theology, I'm happy to get into the weeds of doctrine. I like the intellectual exercise of debates and disagreements. But at the end of the day, what I care about most is that our theology would capture the beauty and mystery of God in such a way that leads us to transformation. I mean, call me a pietist if you want. I just want people to be like Jesus because still, despite everything, I find him utterly compelling. It's also why, despite all the time and energy I put into the interesting questions of whether you should be Protestant, Catholic, or Orthodox, a lot of me doesn't care which you choose. I just want people to seek Christ. I care about these conversations because doctrine matters. I spend time reading this stuff because it's inherently interesting to me. I get most passionate about it, though, if I think somehow a doctrine is leading people away from Jesus, because that's to miss the point. But at the end of the day, it's Jesus that matters to me. As I think about the Christian life these days, I just want to know Christ. I want to learn to pray. I want to work for the good of the people he gave his life for. When it comes to this work that I do, I want to insist on the beauty of Christ in the gospel. It's that beauty that drew me in and has changed my life. Learning more has further instilled in me that this is the most beautiful idea and the fact that it's true is the greatest joy. I want others to find that. So if you're listening to this, that's my prayer for you, that you would seek and find not necessarily all the answers that you're looking for, but the living God who is both nearer to you than your inmost self and higher than the heavens themselves. The God who is personal and transcendent, revealed and still mysterious.